In this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of physics in Amazon Sumerian. More specifically, we are going to look at collider components, rigid body components, and how together they make physics. So let's get started. Okay, I'm here in my scene, and in the last video, we added a few different entities to our scene. More specifically, we added this game ball. Now the game ball right now is sitting, we placed it right above this table, and the table is above the ground, but they're all just suspended in air. And let's just see what happens when we press play. Not surprisingly, nothing happens when we press play. That's because we have not enabled anything within our scene to respond to gravity or enabled them to collide with each other. So there's a few different components we need to take a look at. Let me increase the size of my screen a bit. Okay, so make it a little easier to see. What we need to do first is we need to add some collider components to each of our the game ball and the table. So let's do that first. I'm going to select my table offset, and then I'm going to open that up and select the table. I need to actually add this to the table, not the table offset, because I want it to wrap around this actual table itself. The collider entity, and the collider component, we'll see how that works in just a moment. So with the table selected, let's click Add Component, and we will select Collider. Now, if you see the shape is automatically a box, that's because the shape of the collider is wrapping itself around this table, which is actually a box. Now, the half extents, we're not going to worry about the trigger right now or the restitution. We will look at trigger in another video. But the half extents, we don't really want to change those. But I'm just going to change these just so you can see what these are doing. And I'm actually in play mode. I need to stop. All right, now that let's return this back to 5. You can see here that there's a green wire frame wrapping itself nice and snugly around this table. If I return that value to 6.6 and 0.6 here on, oops, I did not mean to do that. You see how the collider entity, the collider frame is, it's larger now than our actual box. That means that even though the visual entity ends, here and here, the collider part of it, or the collider mesh, will extends beyond it. The collider component extends beyond it. So the ball, it could actually land over here where it doesn't appear there is a table, but the collider extends to that far, so it will. So that's how colliders work. I'm going to return these to 0.5, so it will land perfectly on the table and will fall off the table, respectively to the edge of the mesh. All right. So that's all we really need to do to the table. We don't want the table to move, at least fall to the ground. We want it to stay suspended. The ball, however, we do want to fall. So we're going to add 2 components to the game ball. I'm going to select the game ball. The first thing I'm going to add is also a collider. Now here you can see that the shape of the collider by default is a box. You see how it's much larger. And let's just see what happens when we press play. This will demonstrate a little bit better what I was trying to say a minute ago. Well, actually, I take that back. We haven't added a rigid body, so nothing will happen. So we'll just keep moving. The shape, let's change to sphere. But there we see that the collider component extends well beyond the sphere. So we need to change the radius a bit. So we're going to change the radius to 0.3. You see how it's starting to narrow down a little bit closer to the size of the sphere. Let's try 0.15. Now if we zoom in, that's pretty tight. It's not exact, but it's close enough. So that'll work. So we'll leave it at 0.15 for the radius. Okay, now to get at the fall, we need to add a component, and we're going to add a rigid body. A rigid body component is essentially a component that will add gravitational pull to an entity. We don't want to apply gravitational pull to everything in our scene, and that's not how Sumerian works. You actually have to apply a rigid body to specific entities that you want to fall to the ground or fall through space. So we will select a rigid body component, and we're not going to do anything else at the yet, and we'll press play and see what happens. There we go, perfect. And it rolls off. And it rolls off through the floor. I'll zoom in at the moment. Right, so it rolls off the table, it hits the table, and rolls off the table. So it's acting the way we want. However, we do want there to be a collider on the floor so it can land on the floor as well. So lastly, we need to add a collider to the ground. So we'll select the ground entity, we'll select add component, and then add a collider. Now again, the shape, if you zoom out, let's look at our ground. It's this large disk. And if we have a box-shaped collider around that disk, it's going to be this huge box, which we don't want. What we do want is an infinite plane. So the infinite plane will then extend infinitely beyond the disk. So what actually, and we'll see how this works in a moment. So let's zoom in. You can see the collider shape there on this disk. Let's press play, see what happens. See the ball land, fall through the air, land on the table, lands on the floor, and then it continues to roll. Now if we wait, you'll see it going towards the edge of the disk, and because it has an infinite plane collider, it will just keep rolling infinitely off into space. So that's the way an infinite plane works, which is fine for our situation, our use case here. And that's the basics of physics. Physics are usually comprised of a rigid body and colliders. Rigid body, again, to repeat or to summarize, rigid bodies are collider or components that are added to entities to add a gravitational pull to them. However, that doesn't mean that entities will actually run into each other or be able to collide with each other. That's what the collider component is for. So these two components work in tandem to create basic physics within Amazon Sumerian. We hope you join us for the next video.